Aaron, I need your help on this one because I've noticed that. Have you ever done this? Have you ever done a correction and then saw it wasn't perfect? You know what? And you had another slot. Let's say you could layer on another set of corrections, and usually it's not my experience. It's not what you expect to happen, right? So you have this correction that's close to perfect, and you're like, you know what? Let me add just a little bit more correction on top of it. Not changing the original correction, but layering on another correction based on after measurements. And what I found is it's not the result that I expect to see because I'm stacking filters.
Yeah.
You over process.
What have you noticed?
Over process. I don't know, but like most of the time, if I run Dirac, I will EQ everything first, right? Like I'll try to get everything pretty tidy, and then let Dirac run and do its business. But it's rare that I go back. Actually, in my car, I will say that I've gone back on mid bass and try to fix some things because I don't think it works as well in the car. Which we've talked about this before, for a couple reasons. At least from like maybe the 100 hertz to 300 hertz region. So I have gone back and re-EQ'd in that particular area, but for a home, you don't have the same issues that drives the problems that are caused in the car. So I haven't had to go back and really do anything after I run Dirac. Like I say, usually what I'll do is I'll just EQ stuff before, right? Like I'll say, I can go ahead and take that out. It's a big peak somewhere or something. I'll just go ahead and take that out. I'm not going to let Dirac try to fix that when it's got other crap I want it to focus on. So that's kind of my mindset.
Any experience with that, Jeremy?
So I actually haven't really fired up REW. I need to pick up a mic because I'd be very interested to run like some of the decay time measurements in my room and see where those are coming out. But I've been pretty happy with Anthem Arc, and I've just kind of stuck with it. Well, the other thing that's kind of prevented me from even, I guess, bothering to pick up is Arc Genesis has its own quick measure. So if you kind of want to run a sweep without correction applied, the software lets you do that as well. So I'll play around with that because the subs I have are some Arndal Sound 1723s. They have their own PEQs, and I've tinkered with like using some of that ahead of using Arc versus not engaging any of those and just letting Arc do everything. I'd say most of the results have kind of come out fairly equitable, but yeah, it's something that I need to play with more because I think there are some more. There'd be some advanced measurements in REW that would be neat to see the results of in my space that I haven't played with yet.
Yeah, did you say MySpace?
I'll be posting them on MySpace. I'm leaving YouTube to go to MySpace.
Perfect.
Yeah, so I guess to answer the question, my personal recommendation is to not stack digital filters because you may get an unintended consequence.
Yeah.
Because
so I've run into where you can create other issues and doing not necessarily stacking them, but having filters that are maybe too close to another one. And the other thing that I sometimes have noticed too is that, and it's not always the case, but it's occasionally where I've run into like if I use a steep notch filter in like the sub bass, mid bass area, that sometimes it actually sounds worse. Like I'll convince myself that it sounds better, and then maybe I'll come back a day or two or whatever later and listen, and then I'll think, man, that don't sound right, and then I'll un-EQ that one band, and then it actually sounded better than it did before because I was just going off of what was on the screen and I wasn't taking the time to really listen to it, and for whatever reason, that filter wasn't the appropriate filter. And I've also found that, and this is contrary to what I would normally think and maybe even recommend, is that wider Q. So typical graphic EQ is like a Q of 4 or 4.3. That's the bandwidth. And then parametric EQs can go anywhere from like a 0.5 all the way up to teens, 20s, whatever. And basically the lower the number is, the wider that EQ band is. So if you wanted to EQ down at like 300 hertz, if you've got a 0.5, then that 300 hertz is also going to go out to maybe 1 kilohertz and 100 hertz or something. It's going to be very wide, so it's going to affect a lot of other stuff around it. But if you have the Q, the bandwidth set to maybe 20, well, it's going to focus right on about 300 hertz, and it may hit 302, and 298, but it's going to be like really tight right on that band. So going back to what I was saying was that I found that using maybe a wider EQ of like a graphic EQ of like a 4 or something sometimes tends to work better in the mid bass area, which I'd say like 80 to 300 hertz, than a narrow Q of maybe 10 to 20 or something like that. So I would recommend that if you are EQing based on REW, like your screen only, to make sure to go back and listen as you make adjustments. So make an adjustment, play a test track, and it's kind of a cheap plug for what Joe and them do, or you can just play a test tone or whatever. Go back and listen and see if you like that change before you start going to the other frequencies. Because it's really easy to see all these things on the screen and just start EQing stuff like crazy, and then listen to it an hour later and think, well, that doesn't sound right. And you have no idea why it sounds bad because you've got 20 bands of EQ all within a few, octaves of each other. So that's my word of advice.
So here's from just experience, right? So with a miniDSP, you have PEQs that you can put on the input area, right? So you have like, your left and right input. You can put PEQs into each one of those, right? And you can also, where most people put it, is on the output side, right? Where it shows you the 4 subwoofers or whatever you have connected, and each one of those has its own PEQ. Mm-hmm. So one thing I tried before was, okay, so, let's just say I'm doing one subwoofer. So you do this equalization, right? You put the PEQs into the output section. Now you go and you measure it and you're like, you know what? All right, that looks pretty good. It looks better than what I had before. But you know what? I want to make it a little bit better. So, my thought was, well, I still have the input PEQ. What if I just change that just a little bit to make it even better, right? And a lot of times it made it worse. So why does that make sense? And I think it's because I measured something acoustically, right? It's the effect of that speaker and the room and whatever's happening in the room. I fixed it with a digital correction and then measured again acoustically, right? So if I add another digital correction on top of that, it's not doing what I thought it was going to do. What is actually happening, and when I say stacking corrections, is those 2 corrections, the one that I made before and the one I made after, is making a new filter, right? Mm-hmm. And that filter is maybe a filter that I would have never used, right? If we're to actually look at what the filter is, we'll be like, yeah, no, that's a no. I'm not going to use that filter. It looks horrible. But that's actually the filter that's applied to the signal at the end of the day, right? It's not out and then,
right? Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I think that's what's happening, and that's why I don't recommend doing it twice. I think you want to measure once and make a correction on that.
I say measure twice, cut once.
That's right. I was thinking the same thing.
Does that make sense though? What I said? I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. It's just you're adding 2 filters. I mean, when you don't necessarily need to. It's very rare that I've seen a case where I thought 2 filters, stacked like you're saying, is necessary, unless maybe it's like, you only have so much attenuation available for one particular filter, or maybe you have a couple bands that for whatever reason they're right next to each other, so it makes more sense to maybe put a wider Q on one and a more narrow Q on another. But I got to be honest, at some point I think it's so easy to split the hairs on something like that and wind up getting worse sound than it would have been if you'd have just kind of kept it simple, stupid, right? And just listened to it in between. I mean, I've run into that numerous times where I've helped tune stereo systems in cars or listen to them, and I thought, man, that phase, like you can, with bass, that's one of the things that's easier for me to pick out is phase alignment and bass. And you can always, or at least I can always tell when there's something that's just not quite right if I just listen to like a handful of test tracks. Anything that has like a bass guitar in it, if it lights up the system, then something's wrong. Then you got to go figure out why. And there's been many cases where I've looked at somebody's equalization filters and been like, well, you've got like, 10 bands of EQ and they're all from 100 to 300 hertz. Like that's way too much. You don't need that much equalization. You need to go find the trouble spots and fix those, and then just use a little bit of alignment for the other ones. But you don't need to start dumping, Q of 20 for every freaking band that you see just to get everything perfect. It's going to sound worse.
I see people doing that a lot of times, like in some of the groups that I'm in, where they're showing their graphs. And it's like, and it looks
It
as
looks
good as it's
perfect.
gonna get. And
Yeah.
they're like, no, I gotta work on this one. I'm like, dude, why? Like,
Yeah.
it's almost like a joke now. Like I joke with these guys, like, bro, how flat do you want that thing? How perfect does it need to be?
And then what happens as soon as they move over to the next seat?
Yeah, it's gone.
Like it all goes out the window, you know. But 70% of us only listen by ourselves.
Yeah, so who cares? I think it's just the fun of doing it sometimes.
That's why I say we all just need to learn to live with sound bars. Forget everything.
If you're interested in joining us in the after show, you can visit patreon.com/daily hi-fi. We'd love to hang out with you and get to know you better. We're going to have a lot of fun.